Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Should I close that little box in the corner?
I don't worry about it.
Are you sure? We can just leave it there?
No one's
Sorry,
gonna see
we're
it.
looking at a screen, looking at you, and something's popped up that's never popped up before. I hope everybody has had a fantastic week. Thank you all for joining us at this new and improved time, 10 a.m., because we had
Is it
some
improved?
scheduling conflicts. It might be for some people.
Perhaps we'll be more sharp.
Zone.
Maybe our answers will be slightly sharper. There's more caffeine in our bloodstream.
I have my coffee the
Then
size of my
after
head,
lunch-
which is what I start the day with. So
Yes. So, okay, I'm going to say now with 10% clever remarks.
Oh, clever remarks. I was like, marks? We don't mark them. What are you talking about? Welcome to week 4, where we talked all about sharks. Shark Week. We talked about plot. We talked about conflict. We talked about reprising internal and external journey lessons from our structure and outline course, and then went into a little more detail. And then we were looking at troubleshooting plot challenges in various genres, knowing that you guys are writing in everything from literary fiction to spec to fantasy to romance to, what have you, historical. And then we finished, appropriately enough, by looking at endings, even though we're in the middle of the course.
It's a very bold thing.
We're just crazy like that. Yeah.
It's a bold thing.
There's method to our madness.
There's totally method to it. And I think that sometimes people are surprised. It's like, how can I be writing an ending now when I've hardly even started? So we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about the rationale there. Yeah, for sure. Do you want to maybe start covering assignment 1?
I will. So
all sorts of things are popping up
on
on the
screen.
I
usually turn my email off here.
Okay.
Just for Annabelle's sake.
Sorry, it's a little bit distracting.
I'm going to turn off.
We're staring at a laptop because that's where the camera is for us to talk to you. But Andrew's got all of these bells and whistles.
Normally I turn off the bells and whistles, but because it's morning, okay. Perhaps we will not be as sharp as I had predicted.
Caffeine. Speak for yourself.
Okay, assignment number 1, genre. We asked you to think about the genre you're writing in and consider the challenges that this genre will have in terms of plot, because they are different. Sarah Ruby worked on teasing out the difference between literary fiction and historical fiction. And we're inspired by Sarah Dunant's distinction between a historical novel and a literary novel set in history. Very interesting.
Yeah.
You also discussed the importance of accuracy when working with a particular historical era. Sarah Burwood, for example, wrote, I very strongly believe that history should not be rewritten for the sake of a story. So in my novel, I want to be true to real facts. This includes large truths, such as getting the details of the Battle of Britain or the Blitz correct, or small truths, such as what were Spitfire pilots given to eat for breakfast when on duty? And the answer is bacon and eggs.
I'm glad to hear that they were given a decent breakfast.
Well, considering what everyone else in the UK was eating at that time, they would have been...
That's pretty good.
Getting bacon and eggs would have been pretty...
You're fortunate. I want to just intersperse there for a second. You're fortunate that you're actually able to research that, and World War II is recent enough history that you are able to go back and there's still people alive you could talk to, or you can look at documentation. Where this becomes a little bit more of an issue is when you just don't have access to whatever that is. So let's say you're writing about medieval Europe. There may be things where places where your research just runs out, and then you have to start making those sorts of decisions. So, and I have some other thoughts about that too, but maybe let's finish reading the comments. Rosanna, do you want me to read Rosanna?
Sure.
VEP had similar ideas about historical accuracy. I would like to be praised as someone who's done their research. While I do love the possibilities and imaginings of what could have been, I also value the truth of history, and I want to get things right. And doing a huge amount of research is almost paramount when wanting to set something at a specific time. Otherwise, why bother? At the same time, getting totally bogged down in the minute details is not always practical when writing a fictional story. So these are great comments, and they're really sort of thought-provoking, and I want to respond to just a couple of things there. I absolutely agree with you that matter of getting bogged down, and particularly when you're writing about an area where you can do a lot of research. So I'm thinking World War II, for instance, or Victorian London or something like that, where there is a lot of documentation. There's a lot of museums you can go to. You can walk around the streets of London and kind of squint your eyes and it'll look like what it looked like then. There's lots that you can do. Then it becomes a question of, okay, how much of this am I actually including? And how much is it just a dump of everything that it's too precious to me to throw away? And those become real aesthetic concerns. When you go further back in time, or if you're looking at a particular time and place, for instance, where perhaps less was written about it, then you're dealing in a kind of interesting zone where you have that sort of circle of stuff that you can know for sure. You have a kind of hazier penumbra around that of stuff where you can make an educated guess, and then you have the blackness, which is your creative space where you may be forced to invent things because there's just no way of accessing that information. And so, as much as people who are on that end of the spectrum where they feel that real fidelity to truth, you may be forced into a position of kind of acknowledging what you don't know and knowing that you need to step into that area. I think, though, also, I mean, they're at one end of the spectrum, Sarah Burwood and Rosanna VP. There is, of course, as we discussed in the week's module, that other end of things where people do intentionally subvert or change the historical record to suit the purposes of the narrative. And I'm sort of the same view as you guys, which is when I, in my historical writing, when I've changed things, I've always pointed that out so that the reader is able to distinguish the two, and they're not coming to my fiction thinking that they're reading history. I'm saying I changed the time of this battle, or I rolled these two characters into one. I like to make it clear when I do that, but I also don't feel that I'm not allowed to do those things. And I think there are writers who, push that to further and further extremes. We talk about Wayne Johnson, I think, in the
Colony of Unrequited Dreams.
Colony of Unrequited Dreams, Navigator of New York, where he does all kinds of crazy stuff.
The movie Inglourious Bastards.
Have not seen it.
It's a Quentin Tarantino film, and he takes vast liberties with the history of World War II.
Not to mention the spelling of the English language. I have issues.
Perhaps that's a clue. What you're about to see here is not particularly true.
I mean, actually, yeah, that kind of could be true. And there are reasons, there can be aesthetic reasons for doing that. So, if you find that thematically what you're playing with is something like, the nature of truth or the nature of memory and how memory can distort and corrupt, then maybe taking license with historical facts could tie in very nicely with the work that you're doing. But if your sort of thematic goals are more, I want to capture a time and a place that people don't know very much about, and I want to be as true to it as I can, then you're going to be, approaching the research in a different way. So just to say that there is not a right or wrong approach, only an approach that is to a greater or lesser degree informed by your thematic intentions.
And one thing I'll add too is, as Annabelle alluded to in her own book and other books, if you're reading a book that's historical or has historical settings, often it's really interesting to read the endnotes, the author's notes, because a good author will, an author who cares about this stuff will tell you about their research process. They will talk about what they did, who they talked to, apologize for mistakes, mention where they made things up.
Acknowledgements are often a place that we skip, and where you'll often find this stuff, all the interesting people that they spoke to and the books that they used.
Jennifer Egan's last book, Manhattan Beach, was set mostly during World War II in New York in the Naval Yards. And then she talks about the historical societies that were around. She spent time living there. The archives she looked through, inspirations for some stuff. Yeah, very fascinating. If you're into that, I would totally recommend digging around the backs of the books.
Yep.
All right.
And then, do you want to carry on with the next little?
On similar lines, some of you are working in speculative fiction and fantasy, which is more my area than historical fiction. And many of the responses you wrote revolved around issues of world building and how much information to include without overwhelming the reader. Yeah. B. Thomas wrote, one big problem I'm dealing with, which is common in a lot of speculative stuff, is not to be too tempted to jam all the elements of my world into my story. I did a lot of world building, and it's very tempting to reference all of that, but that can suffocate the story if I'm not careful. It's often better to hint than explore explicitly, and I agree 100% with that. As with all world building, you yourself, the writer, needs to know stuff, but everything you know doesn't have to make it onto the page as long as it informs what's on the page. And it's especially true when you're inventing something that nobody knows anything about. You definitely have to get out the fact that, hey, your characters are actually three-legged marsupials living in an alternate version of Earth where the dinosaurs are still alive. There's things that you need to get out fairly quickly to let everyone know this is not business as usual. And don't write that novel. It sounds really silly.
And there's also questions of sort of staggering how you bring out the information.
Yes, it doesn't all have to come out at once. The info dump is there are certain types of science fiction that are renowned for this, and I don't like that sort of style of writing. There are lots of ways, and we talk about some of them this week and in the future, about getting important information out in a subtle way that integrates with the story.
Yeah.
Those of you working in more genres, if that's a thing, such as romance or fantasy, considered ways to avoid the pitfalls of genre fiction. Julia M. Witt, who is writing a romance novel, plans to pay attention in these areas: being too cliched with characters and stories, being consistent in tone and language, especially when describing more intimate scenes, and ensuring there's enough story between the sex scenes to keep a reader interested.
Always a concern with the romance, yeah. And I think Julia is really being very smart and very astute in zooming in on character when you're talking about romance writing, because that's where a lot of the interest really lies. And, you know, as great as sex scenes are, it's not really about that. It's about the clash of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, or I don't know, pick some other
Romeo and
pair
Juliet.
of romance characters. He's never read a romance in his life, you know, but it's all about the specifics of the interaction, because we can sort of take that airplane at 3,000 feet view and say, you know, it's, I don't even want to say boy meets girl, because, you know, that's kind of outmoded, but person meets person. They have fights, they come apart, they come together, they come apart, they come together, whatever it is. But when you zoom in and you actually do that detailed character work, that's where the romance really gets us. That's where we become really engaged, is with the characters. So I think that Julia's really smart to zero in on that. And then finally, Night Owl had a thought about structure in relation to the genre of crime fiction. So, and is quoting here, but a crime story is a carefully orchestrated series of reveals, the right information at just the right time. And Night Owl says, while this is obvious, I realized that there was something useful under the way that this is written. I want to create a novel arc for the specific reveals, to try and plot the novel within the standard structure, using the specific reveals as markers for when the scenes will appear, instead of the reverse. Plan your scene locations first, which is the usual method of novice plotting.
Sounds interesting.
It sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Go for it, we say.
Yes. Whatever works for you and your project.
Okay. Endings assignment.
Yes, the famous endings, the infamous endings assignment.
All right. So we asked you to write a version of the ending of your story. Overall, learners enjoyed this exercise and found it very useful, but also difficult. Yes, of course. Many found it provided a focus. There was a way to look at how themes came together, showed how the protagonist should develop, and how much of the internal-external journey was still left.
Right. So if we dig into some comments, Karina G wrote, although I know that the main protagonist will die in the end, it was hard to write that last sentence, because I questioned whose words were those. And that's great. That makes you solve a big kind of aesthetic problem when you kill off your protagonist. You're forced to think about that. So at this point, I think that what I wrote today will be the scene before the ending, and I need to think more about the ending in itself, the narrator and other characters. I found it hard to write the end, not because of the protagonist's destiny necessarily, but more because I don't have a clear picture of the middle of the novel and the other characters who play an important role in the protagonist's trajectory. And I would say to you, yeah, I mean, that makes it a really tough exercise to do the ending when you don't know that information. But at the same time, it's highlighting that you don't know that information. I think it's valuable in that sense. So if you have a sense of even just like the emotional tone or the mood you want to end on, and you say, but I don't actually know how I'm getting there. I mean, it really makes you think, okay, so how am I going to connect these two sort of nodes on the graph of my novel? Like, what has to happen to land me in this spot? Have you ever tried writing the ending before you've written the middle?
Not until we started discussing it during this course. But once I started thinking about it, it started to make a lot of sense, because I used to write kind of blindly before I started outlining, etc., years ago, and not knowing the end, often it would be very difficult, because I would just sort of be groping towards something, and usually the endings were incredibly unsatisfying, because it was just like either some sort of epiphany or something. You know, it's knowing the ending, or at least what you want the ending to be. Yeah, I do that now. Anything I've written the last couple of times I've been writing a novel, and the novella that I published, we knew the ending.
Yeah. In our revising course, Nancy uses the analogy of a home renovation, and she talks about in the context of revising, like it's like renoing. You've got an ugly 80s peach bathroom, and you decide that you're going to change it. And I would argue that this exercise is a little bit getting you into that mindset. You don't go into a home reno saying, well, I don't know what the end is going to be, but I'm
Start
just going to rip it all
chopping.
apart.
Yeah.
You say, no, I want my bathroom to look like this at the end. And therefore, I work backwards from that. What are the things that I need to do? I need to strip the wallpaper. I need to buy new paint. I need to, and you come up with a plan so that you're going to arrive at the end that you want. And I would argue that we're doing something a little bit similar here. And hopefully that makes working backwards seem a little more intuitive.
And I heard a writer, and I forget who, unfortunately, mentioning a way of thinking about a story, which I hadn't heard before. This is a little while back now, but that gave me some insight. And the idea is, if you think about a story, a novel, as almost like as if it's happened already. You say, here is this situation, where this person is now a brave, confident, outgoing person, and previously they were a wreck. How did that happen? And then the story is how you got to the point where this person came into their own.
That's a neat way of thinking about it. Yeah. Should we move on?
Yeah. So Jackie Morrison wrote, I really struggle with this exercise. I don't know if I'll have a trial in the homeless murders or not, but by writing the last chapter, paragraph, and sentence, it forced me to write it as a trial for the accused. It was an interesting exercise, and I ended the character's inability to stop crying by her seeing the assailant taken into jail. I really struggled with that throughout the book. I also concluded it by having good triumph over evil. I will have to work on theme, though, because I didn't incorporate theme into this ending. I'll play with it and see if I keep the ending the same. I see the merit in this exercise.
Great. And theme, as we talk about a little bit in this course, I think, and also in the next course, theme is something that you often, it remains kind of nebulous and squishy. In the writing of the first draft, very literary term, term of art. It remains a little bit elusive in the writing of that first draft. And you may be a couple of drafts into your work before you realize, I thought I was writing a murder mystery, but really I was writing about the unreliability of memory, or, the persistence of love, or, whatever it is. So don't worry if in doing this exercise, you've got a first act, you're forced to write the ending, you don't know what your second act's going to be, and also you don't know your theme. That's okay. Theme is something that tends to come out as you refine the drafts more and more. So I would say don't sweat that.
Don't sweat that at this point.
It's good that you're conscious of it. It's good that you're conscious that that is an element that will have to come in, but I wouldn't try and shoehorn something in quite yet until you have more of a sense of what's going on.
It starts to become apparent often. And if not, it's often if you're describing but it's definitely down the road.
Yeah. So then Professor Owl wrote, I still love that name, Professor Owl.
I think of an owl with a monocle.
I'm seeing an owl in like robes, like when you gown up for convocation, with like the mortarboard and everything.
Perfect.
Making a word cloud helped me elucidate the feeling of the end.
That's an interesting idea. I think that's the first time someone's done a word cloud.
I think so. Yeah. Even though we use one in the materials, we have one in the module around endings, but I don't know that we've had anybody who's actually pursued that. So that's great. The poets, by the way, in our program, I know that they
do use word clouds.
They work with word clouds a lot. And so I think it's really interesting that you use that to get at the emotional sort of moment that you want to capture. So Professor Owl says, when written, that paragraph gave me a surprising insight into my protagonist. The last sentence came as a total surprise to me, and I like it. It makes good sense. I had expected a feeling of closure, but what was revealed to me is that a question has been left unanswered, and it should remain so. Working backwards into the scene, I found that a chunk of random writing I had done earlier made perfect sense here. I'm very happy to see a pattern emerging in this project. Great. I'm so glad that this was useful to you, Professor Owl.
And finally, we have Cheryl Optimist, who wrote that I wish I'd done this exercise with my first novella, as it really helps to guide the preceding scenes. I've written a couple of drafts of the last sentence, paragraph, and scene for the story I'm currently working on, and I've been pleasantly surprised by what has surfaced so far.
Great.
I will continue to draft this final scene whenever I feel my story is drifting. And that's an interesting point, too, the idea that just because you may have written something now does not mean that that is the end of your novel.
Oh, absolutely.
You will be coming back to that. And it may be useful to keep, adjusting your signpost as you make decisions and revelations during the process.
Yeah.
Yesterday morning, I woke up with the perfect last sentence so far, which will lead into the third novella of my planned series. Funny, lighthearted, yet with a sense of my protagonist's next internal and external journey. So that sounds really good.
Fantastic.
Good stuff.
Good work, Cheryl Optimist. So now we're coming to our Hangout questions.
Okay.
Namaford asks, lifespan story arc. I am taking on a character's strongest friendship over a whole lifespan as my story arc. If I'm trying to place the crisis of the story in her 30s, the character's 30s, is that too soon if the healing process slash resolution occurs many years later in her 50s?
That's an interesting question. I mean,
What do you think?
most of the times when I'm thinking about books, I think I'm thinking about things that take place over fairly short periods of time. My sense is it would depend on how you structure time in your book to some
Yeah.
degree. If you're having this crisis happening in the 30s, and then you spend a long time talking about other things, and then you have the climax, the resolution, etc., way later in the book, it may feel disconnected. If you're moving around in time more fluidly, then it probably is not a problem at all.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think it has to do with how you handle the pacing in the story. Well, there's two issues there.
Mhm.
Let's assume first of all that you're just telling the thing chronologically straightforward, like a Bildungsroman. You're starting, with these characters as children and you're taking them up to old age and you're going forward. In that case, if you are trying to move at the same pace throughout the novel, capturing all of the stages of their life, I would say yes, then putting the climax or putting the main kind of crisis moment in their 30s is probably too soon. But you don't normally sort of write that way, right? There will be chunks of time where you'll just be slipping over it quite quickly.
You might say for the next 10 years, nothing much happened. I wouldn't write that sentence.
That particular sentence, but I mean, that may be the case.
10
right?
years later, I met her again.
And
in
it's
Paris.
also, I think also that the nature of the crisis is going to matter, because if it was something that has kind of, if it's something that continues to unfold through the course of the story, let's say it's the diagnosis of a disease that the character lives with for a long time, and it kind of evolves, as new treatments come on, but then as they get sicker, but then this and then that impacts whether or not they have children or whether they've passed this disease down to their children. If the story's still evolving in different ways, we may want to see more of that later story, and that's okay. If the crisis that happened in their 30s is they were both complicit in a murder, and then we need to see the payoff later, where it's a sort of complete closed event, and then the consequences pop up later when somebody who they thought was out of their lives comes back and says, I know what you did. Then maybe we don't need to see that chunk of time in between, or we can pass over it more quickly. But the other piece, this is why I preface this by saying, if we're going through chronologically in a
Right.
straight line, that's one thing. But the other thing, and the other way of handling this, is if you're chopping and changing and jumping back and forth in time. And then, that's more complicated, but you have more leeway to put that crisis wherever you want.
And you can structure that so that the reader's experience is the thing you're controlling, rather than the experience of the things that happened chronologically.
Yes, and you may well begin in old age with them sort of thinking back to this thing that you're teasing us with and not telling us what it was, something like that.
Yeah.
Do you want to read Brenda Ann?
Brenda Ann has a question about denouement.
Yes.
So the 3 examples of superbly written denouement in our week 4 notes are in the first person POV.
Nice catch, Brenda Ann.
Yes.
That was not intentional.
No, we're not trying to send a signal here.
No.
Just, I guess our tastes moved in that direction. In Half-Blood Blues, reference in the notes, Edugin's denouement is also written in first person. Is this preferable to in first person point of view? I will say no.
No, that was not intentional. And I think maybe we need to make a note to ourselves to find a third person example to put in for the next round of the course. It was not intentional.
Okay, now Brenda Ann has a question, quandary. I'm writing my story in third person intimate point of view for both protagonists.
Mm-hmm.
Since the older one dies before the end, after her final wish is fulfilled,
Mm-hmm.
a logical option may be 1, to write the denouement from the remaining character's point of view. Or is it? I'm also considering, would it be too weird to write the denouement in the first person point of view of the deceased character, perhaps addressing the other protagonist, so beyond the grave sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Let's go through all the options.
Okay,
we'll talk
3, switch to third person omniscient for the denouement, or 4, switch to first person for the remaining character for the denouement. Are there other possibilities? I'd much appreciate hearing your opinions on the pros and cons.
You seem to me to have hit on the bulk of the the possibilities are all of the different, you can go into second person if you want to, you can go into first person plural.
We haven't invented any more persons.
But the question is, I don't know why you would.
Yeah.
And, or, phrasing that a little more nicely, you have to have a really solid reason why.
Mhm. Especially if you haven't done that
Yeah,
changes
like
in the book anywhere else.
the Beyond the Grave thing, we see that, right? More and more Lovely Bones and books like that. We see
American
people
Beauty,
sort of
the movie
borrowing
has
that. And I always want to say, but have you earned it? Why?
Yeah.
Thematically, how does it connect? Is it something that's running as a thread throughout the book? If not, how have you earned it on that last page? If it's just you getting around an aesthetic problem, you know, it's like the cavalry coming at the end of the movie. That feels a little bit of a cheat and not really earned. Um, Similarly, switching into first person or switching into omniscient, I don't want to say no, you absolutely can't do that, but I want to say, how is that? How have you seeded that in throughout the novel so that when it comes, we don't go, hey, that's a cheat. We say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's the feeling that you want your reader to have at the ending. I don't see anything wrong with you just telling it third person from the remaining character's point of view.
Because they're the person who's left.
Because they're the person who's left. And if the person who died, if there's something more that you wanted them to convey, such that you're considering the voice from the grave, can they convey that before they die? I mean,
can it be a letter? I mean, that's maybe a bit of a cliche, but
I mean, even that makes a little bit more sense to me.
Mm.
Does that sort of make sense to you as well? Like,
yeah.
it has to relate to theme somehow, and a certain elegancy and consistency, I think, is always admirable in
you don't want it
to
stick out. You want, because you don't want the attention to be drawn to the style. You want the attention to be drawn to the characters and the material.
Deus ex machina, right?
Yes.
Where it's like, oh, I see you, author, trying to solve a problem for yourself. That's not where you want the reader to be on the last page. We want it to be that we're still fully immersed with those characters and not considering technical questions. Alison R.
Alison R.
Final scenes and reveals.
Okay, shall I read this?
Sure.
In the endings assignment, you mentioned that big reveals and surprises should be for penultimate scenes rather than final scenes, which actually slightly connects to what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit more. Does this mean that final scenes should be closer to a slice of life scene, in which there may be emotional shifts, but only small ones? Is there a difference between a reveal or surprise and the twist ending example that was given?
That's the Sarah Waters, I think.
Right. For context, in my novel, I had planned a denouement scene where a character who disappeared in the climax returned. This is a happy surprise rather than a twist, but I'm now wondering whether the ending will feel rushed if this is the final scene.
I think it kind of for me, it comes back to the same thing again. And I don't mean to say that you can't have something surprising happen in the last scene. Sarah Waters certainly does that. I'm thinking of a John Banville novel where you realize that a guy, well, anyway, I don't want to blow it because the last page is really cool, but it's more like, does this raise more questions than it answers, I think. Does that make sense?
Yes, but not only that, but if you do have something that does raise questions, do they fit with the rest of the book? I remember a guy, Gabriel Kay, who's a Canadian fantasy author who writes fairly literary fantasy, had a story, and I forget the story. It may have been Tagana, maybe it's one of his novels I read ages ago. Anyway, at the very end, there's the denouement. Things happen. The characters they're walking and they're returning. I think they're maybe returning where they came from. And right at that moment, there's this tradition that's in the magic of the world that if you see a certain type of magical creature on the road, it means that one of your party will die, one of your party will have a change of life, one of your party will have great success. And there's three of them, and they see one of these right at the end. It was something like that. And I am totally paraphrasing, and it's probably wrong, but basically it suggested, it was just this little thing at the end that said, these people's stories are not over necessarily, but this book is over.
Yeah, and it's not like it's dangling specifics.
And it doesn't change what happened in the book. It doesn't change the meaning of the end, but I thought it was an interesting little, ooh.
Yeah, their lives carry on.
I also thought
with the Sarah Waters too, I'm just thinking that little reveal at the end makes sense of everything that came before. So it's not like it's sending us down a whole new path. It's like, oh, I get it.
So it's a sort of surprise that's like connecting the last piece of the puzzle, maybe.
Yeah.
I also think the idea of, say, someone returning, like someone who disappeared in the climax returns, that also may depend on how you handle something like that. If the main story has been resolved. I mean, I had this image in my mind. I was actually on the bus this morning looking at the questions and thinking just how you could do that in a novel where characters have come to some sort of place, and then maybe in the last line in the distance you see someone walking and you realize, oh, Fred survived after all. And then there's a little surprise, and it's nice. And you don't need to go into great detail about, oh my God, you're alive. It's like this little touch that suggests that things are going to be okay.
Yeah.
And it adds to the already existing things are going to be okay. If everyone was waiting to find out if so-and-so was alive or not, and then they show up, that's different. That feels more like you need to have more of an explanation.
I mean, it has to do with, I think, with any sort of reveal of anything in a novel, you have to think in terms of the sort of the beat that comes after. Like how much time does the reader need?
Yeah.
Logistically as well, how much time do the characters need to absorb that? But how much time does the reader need to kind of absorb that and say, okay, and now I'm ready to move on. And when it happens on the last page, if it's like, and suddenly the nuclear bomb was dropped, and you're like, questions. And then that's the end of the book. It's like, well,
no.
It needs to be something that I think rather than doing that, it should be doing that. It should be bringing us to.
That is a great way to put it.
Some closure. It's a diminuendo marking. Okay, that's not. It's a, what do you call it in math?
You're asking.
Greater than. It's the.
Okay, I could have said that. Greater than, less than.
I don't know.
It's a bracket.
But I think we're probably beating a dead horse here. But you guys understand, like it's more how many new questions I think does it introduce as opposed to how many questions does that thing answer, and it can still be a surprise either way.
Yeah, I like the way you mentioned that. Okay.
The ethics of writing about real people and events. Did I skip one?
No, that's correct.
Okay, that's where we're at. So Anna has sort of collated this one based on a number of participant comments.
Yeah, so some people have been asking.
Oh yes, and shout out to Anna. Hi Anna, thank you for all your work this week.
So obviously people have been chatting a bit about the ethics of writing about real people and events, and this comes up regularly.
Yep.
We have talked about it. We will talk about it, I think, in this course, or was that in the other course?
That's next week.
Next week?
Yeah.
But basically the questions are, what are the ethical considerations about writing about real people and real events? For example, if a novel uses a crime in a court case that really happened as the basis for a thriller or mystery novel, what are the responsibilities of the writer? Is changing the names and identifying details enough? That is an interesting question.
It is. There's many ways to approach that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the first thing you have to think about are the legalities and how that's going to vary from country to country.
Yes, and it does change depending on the country you're in.
And depending on the time that the court case took place. Is it 100 years ago? Was it last year?
If you're writing about the Salem witch trials, you're fine.
You're probably going to be okay. Yeah. So I think that's the first thing is there's always legal sort of questions because you don't want to be risking like slandering somebody who's still alive or something like that.
But I mean, they did do the OJ. There was a fictionalization of the OJ trial, right?
Yes, and the laws in the US, for instance, are quite different from the laws in Canada with regard to how much you can say about somebody who's already
if they're
in
a public figure,
like a celebrity.
Yeah.
So again, you want to be familiar with the law specifically. But I mean, getting past the sort of black letter kind of legal considerations, there's ethical considerations too. So, thinking that, with crime and with court cases, Law and Order has sort of made a living off of basically adapting familiar or vaguely familiar court cases. They've used real court cases as source material.
But what they do, and is what I would probably do if I was doing this, is they take real events that are happening in the courts and then they make a fictional version so that you could say, oh, that's kind of like X and kind of like Y, but not like, oh my God, they totally copied this and they just changed a few names and a tiny number of details, whereas fictionalizing it also, I think, gives you the power to diverge from what really happened.
Yeah.
If you're working on something that actually happened, an actual court case, an actual crime, and many things are known about it, then, I mean, it's a constraint that you have to work within that you wouldn't have if you were fictionalizing and you decided, oh, I really want this person to actually get off on this murder, and then someone to track them down years later, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking too that the sort of bullet form newspaper article version of a court case, once you blow that out into a novel, is going to be different in every novelist's hands.
Of course.
For instance, if you take, the Salem witch trials and you gave it to you to write, and you gave it to me to write, and you gave it to Nancy to write, the same kind of fact pattern, as
We would
lawyers
focus
would call
on
it. You know,
totally different
thematically, we're
things.
looking at different things. It might be, you know, have spec elements in your hands or sort of magic realist elements. It might be a love story in my hands. It might be a thriller in Nancy's hands. You know, like what we're choosing to prioritize and how we're choosing to shape the characters will change the story so much, in a sense, that I think if you're just, you know, if you read an article in the paper about guys go hunting and one shoots another in the face, some of you will recall what I'm referring to there. It's going to be different how you expand that into a 300-page novel.
Yeah. But again, yeah,
sense?
it does. And at the end of the day, if there's any legal queries you have, you know, definitely look into it in your particular jurisdiction,
Yeah.
because you can't look at what someone else has done.
Yeah.
And use that as necessarily a template.
And the flip side of that too is, even if you, and I think we're going to talk about this more next week, but even if you do, let's move away from the crime example, and let's say you want to write about something that happened in your family's history.
Yeah.
You know, you want to write about your crazy uncle or your grandparents, or, you know, the circumstances of your own early life or something like that. And you know that there are people that are real people who you're potentially writing about. You can change the details, and they're still going to recognize themselves and be annoyed with you, or whatever they're going to be with you. But you can also, as a fiction writer, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, you can make characters out of whole cloth, and the people in your life will come to you and say, you were writing about me. And it was never your intent. It was never,
they see
you know,
things
they will look for and find the things that they want to. So there's no getting around that. I mean, as a fiction writer, you're always going to be coming up against other people's emotions and sort of ethical issues. And whether you intend it or not, you're going to be having those conversations with people in your life if you choose to be a fiction writer. So, you know, I regularly have to tell my mother, every mother character that I write is not you. In fact, none of them are you. And it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Right? I never did that to you. It's like, I know you didn't. I'm not saying you did. Where are we at? Racer XLA, the challenge of historical fiction. Too much World War II. I'm going to read this one, and I'm going to let you take this one, because I know that you were working on a novel about World War II.
And I had a little bit too much World War II.
Historical fiction has a story of characters that contrasts with the larger historical story. Many stories are often set around World War II, and the character's story is often a paradox of what is happening in a war, often involving crime, murder, or loss. If I set the story before or after World War II, will it be a cliche? Do you want me to read the whole question, or do you want to take these piecemeal?
Let's do it piecemeal, because there's like 3 questions in here.
Yeah.
So is it a cliche? Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's such a large event that still looms in the history of the world that I don't think it's a cliche, but you do have to be aware of the cliches inherent in writing about World War II, because so many people have written about World War II. So you do have to, and also what your particular take on it. Why are you writing something about World War II now? Is there some aspect of it that hasn't been explored? Is there a viewpoint that is underappreciated? I mean, I was doing research into World War II, which Annabelle knows about. I had a story idea related to strategic bombing, what it's like to be a pilot, not a pilot, but a crew member on what it's like to be on the ground. And I had an idea for a story, but as I researched, it actually ended up, I had the problem of too much research, in that everything was interesting because it is a fascinating period in history. And the further I got, the more threads I pulled on, and then the novel I had ended up sort of just dispersing into the whole war. If I were to do it again, which I would have to focus really, really carefully on the areas I want. But I found it fascinating things about the women who worked looking at photographs, surveillance photographs and camouflage and fine art. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff, and there's stuff that stories still have not been written about. So I don't think it's a cliche, as long as you're aware of the cliches.
I mean, anything can be a cliche.
Yeah.
Right? Any love story, arguably, it's like, well, you know, what love story hasn't been told? But it's all in the telling of it. So I don't think that anything should be off limits or absolutely, you know, available. It's all in how you do it.
And if you have interesting people going through interesting times, then you'll have something interesting.
Yeah.
There, that's put that on your.
So Racer XLA also says, do I really need to have an outer story tied directly to the inner story of the main character? So I think there he's referring back to that idea of, you have the sort of interpersonal thing with the characters going on, but you have this larger kind of historical context swirling around them as well. Racer XLA says, I have a fear that the story could end up being historical fiction, but only dressings and not enough connection with the time period. I would not expect to have the outer story worked out on the first draft, as I plan to do research and intertwine the story's setting. If a novel is set in the past, does it have to be historical fiction? These are such good questions. And we're going to be talking about this more next time. Also.
Yes, but we can give a bit of a jab right now.
Yep.
Do I need to have the outer story tied directly into the inner story of each character, main character? I mean, it depends. That's a bit, but I mean.
Well, I think it comes back to your first question, which is, why are you choosing that kind of outer setting if you're not exploiting some aspect of it or making some aspect of it have resonance with your characters?
Yeah, if your story
is it just because you want to plunk them down somewhere colorful? That
and
feels
then
like a
that
bit of a
could be-
disservice to World War II.
Well, then what you're getting, then you are in the whole dressings, where
Yeah.
you're just putting dressing on something.
Yeah.
If the story, I mean, obviously, as you say, love stories are universal. A love story set in the time of ancient Greece, a love story set in the Middle Ages, a love story set last week, all have certain elements in common.
Yeah.
But if you choose to set your love story that you want to write last week, then you're just writing the story in a contemporary culture. If you choose to set it in the Middle Ages, then you're thinking, there's something about this time and about love that I find interesting. The fact that the love might be between two people of vastly different social classes, or the love could be connected to the Crusades and someone who's a crusader versus an infidel. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities that as Vanderbilt said, if you are choosing a time like World War II, then there must be something in that time that affects the story.
There must be a reason why you chose that. But the other thing I think that needs to be, even beyond that, you need to consider is sort of the gravitational pull of the two stories. And, are they complementing each other somehow? Are they speaking to each other? Or are they pulling apart from each other? And so if you say, okay, I want to tell the story of a guy who grew up very coddled in a rich household, only child. His parents gave him everything he wanted, and he had to learn to come out from under their wing and become his own man and forge his own way in life. And I'm going to set this against the backdrop of World War II, in which millions of people are dying, and there are major themes of racism and just so much of intense ethical kind of weight. Do I care so much about the story of this guy's, coming to terms with his wealth, say, against the Holocaust?
Yeah.
I think that there becomes a kind of imbalance there. Now, if it's the story of, if it's a Schindler's List, if it's I have privilege, how do I use it in the context of this historical, that becomes a little bit more interesting because the two stories are talking to each other. So I think that's another reason to, are you doing a disservice to, or a disrespect even, to your historical setting if you're not acknowledging the full kind of weight and darkness of that? I think that becomes an important thing too.
Yeah. Good answer.
Are we almost, where are we at?
Yes, well, actually,
we're doing pretty well.
We're at.
But,
No.
And then one other thing I made a little note for myself. One other thing too, because we've had a couple of comments come up in the past hour, which are to do with historical fiction as a genre, historical versus literary, or whether historical is literary. And I think it's worth kind of noting that there are different views of this in the publishing world in different countries. So, for instance, in Canada, historical fiction is very often, I think, literary fiction. Like a lot of,
if you look at the list,
very esteemed literary authors will write in this genre, and it's not considered an alternative to literary fiction. In the US, in publishing, historical fiction is often kind of prized apart. And you would say we've got literary fiction, we've got crime fiction, we've got romance, we've got fantasy, we've got historical, we've got speculative. You see what I did there? Like it's kind of prized apart and viewed as a thing unto itself. So I think there can be a little bit of confusion when people are working on this as to, what is it that I'm doing? So, that's worth noting as well. And that really interesting last question of Racer XLA, if a novel is set in the past, does it have to be historical fiction? And my answer to that is no.
No, it would depend on your definitions so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can have a novel set in the past that someone would clearly say this is a romance, and some, it's set in an earlier time. Someone would say this is a work of dark fantasy set in the Middle Ages. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not a historical novel, really. That's like necessarily. I mean, this is where the genre categories get pulled out sometimes, and
I'm thinking of some of Jan Kutsia's work where he's writing something set in, Dostoevsky's time or something like that. But the style and the way the novel moves, there's something very inherently modern about it, and you want to say it is a very modern literary novel that happens to be set, in another time and place, but
Kazuo
that's kind of
Ishiguro's
secondary a little bit.
last book, The Bird Giant, is also essentially a unusual literary novel with elements of fantasy set in like Arthurian England. So it's very the categorization in some of these books are fluid, and that's okay.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
okay.
we're in a time definitely when people are playing with genre categories a lot more.
Last question.
It's not even a question.
Night Owl, totally off topic, but I would love it if you could put together a few new edX courses, such as creative nonfiction, perhaps, or short story.
Why don't we just whip one up this
I read this
afternoon?
comment, and that was exactly what I thought. We'll just toss one together. And I'm not being dismissive, Night Owl. We're so grateful that you like the courses this much and that you'd have interest in more. And we're super honored and flattered by that. Having said that, do you want to speak to how long it took us to put these three together?
Well, yeah, it's like making a novel, oddly enough. I mean,
it's like making three novels.
Like 3 novels, and it took us 3 years, I think, didn't it?
Start to finish, probably.
Start to finish.
Yeah.
We also, and not because it was 3 years of sitting and pounding out material, but 3 years of having to also teach and have families and do all the other things. And to make sure the stuff is good, it takes a while.
It's really time consuming, and to track down all of the authors that we were able to bring to you. I mean, that's not something that you can do in even 6 months. We grabbed people as they were coming through town for like writers festivals. We went to more than one writers festival. We grabbed people if they were guests in our department, like Jeff Vandermeer, or we went to, I think you guys went to Victoria to do SEDG.
We did. So we went to Victoria. Like we did a little bit of traveling.
There was traveling to capture people as well. Sounds like I put them in little glass jars.
We kind of did. Metaphorically speaking.
It's a lot of work.
But we do have interest in doing some more non-credit courses. Not saying we're not going to do it, but just that it won't be fast.
No.
There is interest. We have to find faculty who have the time and the ability. We need to find a little bit of money to do the work. But we do have some plans.
Well, that's the thing too, is there's a lot of costs involved in doing this, because we remunerate the people that we interview, and
we have to pay a film editor to edit the
film editor. We had to buy equipment to do all of the saga of the lights. Do you remember the hot lights?
Yes, we used to have hot lights. Now we have cool lights.
Andrew was constantly burning himself on these lights.
Zumba All the Way says, are you guys having a new class in September? I think I saw it somewhere. Just a new run of the existing classes for now.
What's running next? Remind us.
In September, we're doing structure and outline again.
And Nancy will be back with us.
Yes. Woo. And then we're doing this course in October. And then January, we're going to be doing edit and revise.
Edit and revise, yeah, which is our
I am working on a super secret project related to writing, but it's...
Do I know about this? I don't think I know about this.
Secret. Well, no, it's related to video game writing.
Oh, that one. I know a little bit about that.
But we won't have any announcements on that probably till next year sometime. And maybe many of you are not interested in writing for video games.
It's not super secret anymore, Andrew.
No.
To quote the final episode of Game of Thrones, once more than 2 people know about it, it's not a secret, it's information.
It's just us 2.
And more than 2 people.
But less than 1,000.
Game of Thrones is over. Does anyone else feel my pain?
Sorry.
Yeah. Next week, we are talking about research. And we have had throughout the course a number of sort of concerns come up where we said, wait till week 5, wait till week 5. Week 5 is my favorite week of this course. I love all this research stuff. When in the process of writing should you do it? How much should you do? How do you incorporate it without it being the dreaded info dump? How do you know when to throw stuff away? What are some of the ethical concerns? Like, we're going to come back to all of this.
Yeah, and in depth.
Yes.
So we shall have a fun hangout next week.
I love research week.
Research is good. I mean, one of the things is, I know several writers who research they enjoy it so much it could be a form of procrastination.
We're going to talk about that too.
Yeah.
Preventing it from becoming that. Yes.
But it is a pleasure. I'm going to be doing some research. Yeah. I mean, I'm almost doing research, but I'd like to do a research trip this summer, perhaps.
Ooh,
yeah, just
that's
a little
exciting.
one. Just to.
He's going to Mars. Happy research, everybody. You will be doing, as you can probably guess, a research assignment this week. So enjoy, and we will look forward to seeing you back. I believe we're
At the
back to
regular
1
time,
o'clock
all going
Pacific
well,
time,
1
right?
o'clock Pacific
Yeah,
time.
we just had a glitch this week. So happy writing, everyone. We will look forward to seeing you all next week and bring all of your questions for us. Take care.
Bye.